So, I have to admit, I've always found world maps incredibly soothing.
Oh, really? Soothing
Well,
how?
you look at one and everything just seems so settled, you know?
Right, yeah.
You have these crisp lines, distinct colors for every country, the vast calm blue of the oceans. It gives you this sense to you that the world is finished, like the boundaries are permanent.
Oh, right.
But after going through the stack of research for today's deep dive, I'm realizing that map is essentially a lie, or at least a very convincing optical illusion.
It is an illusion of stability, absolutely. We tend to look at a map as a snapshot of how things are. But if you look at it through the lens of political geography,
hmm
it's actually a storyboard of a fight that is currently paused.
That is, well, a slightly terrifying way to put it.
Yeah.
But it tracks with the material. We aren't just looking at geography today for you guys listening. We're looking at the operating system that runs the world.
Ex
And the sources we have, which range from geopolitical strategy papers to these deep historical analyses, they suggest that two massive, often contradictory forces are just constantly rewriting those lines on the map.
and those forces are political power and territoriality. Sounds a bit like an academic lecture title, I know, but
But these are the engines of history.
exactly, they
Yeah.
really are.
Right. So let's set the stage. On one side, you have political power. This is the strategic capacity to influence behavior and control resources. It's the cold, calculated chess game. And on the other side, you have territoriality.
Which is the hot, emotional side of the equation. Territoriality is that deep, almost primal connection people have to the land. It's the difference between merely occupying a space and feeling like that space is part of your soul.
And the friction between these two, the cold strategy and the hot emotion, that's where the sparks fly.
Definitely.
We have a lot to get through today. We're going to talk about regions that act like shatter belts, which is maybe the most metal term in geography, by the way.
It is a great term.
We'll navigate choke points where the global economy can be strangled by a single ship, and we'll unpack the invisible empire of neocolonialism.
It really is a tour of the world's vulnerabilities.
So let's start with the big, messy concept, the shatter belt. When I first read this term in the source material, I pictured a literal earthquake zone. But we're talking about political earthquakes here.
Right, a shatter belt is a region that is internally fragmented and competitively crushed from the outside. Geopolitically, these are areas that just cannot seem to hold it together. They're defined by what geographers call fragmentation.
But it's not just that they are messy on the inside, right? Because plenty of countries have internal disagreements. The definition seems to hinge on where they are located.
Location is everything here. Shatter belts are almost always sandwiched between major global superpowers. They're the buffer zones.
Ah, okay.
So you have this region that is already internally weak. Maybe it's split by different religions, ethnicities, or languages. And then you have these giant external powers pushing and pulling on it to gain influence.
It's like a cracked windshield. It's already fragile, and then two people start pushing on it from opposite sides.
That is a great analogy. And because the region is internally divided, the local groups often ally with the external powers against each other. One group sides with superpower A, the other with superpower B.
Which makes the conflict impossible to contain.
Exactly.
The classic example the reading brings up is the Balkans. And I think for a lot of us, the Balkans is just a shorthand for complicated history. But if we look at the start of World War I, that was a textbook shatter-built scenario.
It was. In the early 20th century, the Balkans was this chaotic mix of Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, and others, all vying for national identity. But look at who was pressing in on them.
Right.
You had the Austro-Hungarian Empire from the north, the Ottoman Empire from the south, and a Russian Empire from the east.
So when the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand happened in Sarajevo, it wasn't just a local crime. Because of that Shatterbelt dynamic, it pulled all those external superpowers into the vacuum.
Precisely. The internal fracture triggered the external alliance systems. The Shatterbelt broke, and it took the whole world with it. And we saw the same dynamic later in the 20th century with Eastern Europe during the Cold War.
Right, the Iron Curtain wasn't just a wall, it was a Shatterbelt. You had the Soviet sphere pushing west and the NATO sphere pushing east. These regions are cursed by their geography. They happen to be where the tectonic plates of global power grind together.
And we can't ignore the resource aspect either. These aren't usually barren wastelands. Shatterbelts often hold valuable resources, which makes the superpowers even more desperate to control them. It cranks up the pressure on that cracked windshield.
So that's the Shatterbelt where power is fragmented and chaotic. I want to pivot to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, places where power is incredibly concentrated and terrifyingly narrow. The choke points.
Yeah, but Shatterbelt is a broad region. A choke point is a needle's eye. These are narrow geographic passageways, usually straits or canals that restrict movement. They are the bottlenecks of the world.
And the logic here is pretty simple. If you control the narrow hallway, you control who gets into the building. But the scale of leverage is what blew my mind. We aren't just talking about charging a toll. We're talking about holding the global economy hostage.
It is the ultimate leverage. Take the Strait of Hormuz. It connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. It's incredibly narrow, yet a massive percentage of the world's seaborne oil passes through it.
The notes mention that Iran controls the northern shore of this strait, and this has been a geopolitical flashpoint for decades. It seems like every time tensions rise in the Middle East, the conversation immediately turns to what happens if Iran closes the strait.
Because they can. That is the asymmetric power of a choke point. Iran doesn't need to defeat the U.S. Navy in a pitched battle to hurt the West. They just need to sink a few ships in the narrowest part of the channel or even just threaten to mine it.
And suddenly, the price of oil doubles in London and Tokyo, and the global economy drops into a recession.
The mere threat is a weapon. It forces other powerful nations to treat Iran with a certain level of caution because the economic fallout of a closure is mutually assured destruction.
Now, Hormuz is a natural choke point, but we've built our own vulnerabilities too. The Suez Canal is the big one here.
The Suez is interesting because it redefined naval power. Before it was dug, if the British Empire wanted to send a ship to India, they had to sail all the way around Africa. It took weeks. The canal was a shortcut that became the jugular vein of the British economy.
There's a specific event in the research, the 1956 Suez Crisis, that really illustrates how this power works. Egypt decided to nationalize the canal, basically kicking out the British and French shareholders.
And the reaction from Britain and France was telling. They didn't just send an angry letter. They launched a military invasion alongside Israel to take the canal back. They felt that losing that choke point was an existential threat to their status as great powers.
But, and this is the key historical pivot, they failed. Not militarily, but politically. The U.S. and the Soviet Union forced them to back down.
Which signaled the end of the old colonial way of doing things. It proved that simply having the biggest navy doesn't mean you can hold a choke point if the rest of the world turns against you. But the canal remains a vulnerability. We saw that recently when the Ever Given container ship got stuck.
Right. One ship goes sideways, and global trade creates a backlog for months. It shows how fragile this operating system really is.
It proves that efficiency comes with a high price. We've funneled the world's wealth through these tiny straws. It's efficient, yes, but it's incredibly risky.
Speaking of efficiency and risk, that leads us into the next layer of political power. We've talked about armies and canals, physical control. But in the modern world, you don't always need a gunboat to control a country. Sometimes you just need a bank ledger.
We are entering the realm of neocolonialism.
This is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but I want to drill down into the mechanics of it. The premise is that while traditional colonialism, planting the flag, running the government, has largely ended, the control didn't stop. It just mutated.
Mutated is a good word for it. Neocolonialism is the use of economic, political, or cultural pressure to control or influence other countries, especially former colonies. The argument is that these nations have political sovereignty, they have their own flag and UN seat, but they lack economic sovereignty.
The source material pairs this with dependency theory. This was a real light bulb moment for me. It explains why some countries seem permanently stuck in a developing stage. It's not that they aren't trying, it's that the system was built to keep them there.
Dependency theory argues that the global economy has a core of wealthy nations and a periphery of poor nations. The key insight is that the periphery was designed by the core to be resource extractors, not partners.
Let's look at the scramble for Africa as the origin story here. When European powers carved up the continent, they didn't build infrastructure to help African nations trade with each other.
No, look at the railroad maps from that era. The train lines don't connect major African cities to one another. They run from the mines or the plantations straight to the coast. The entire infrastructure was engineered for extraction, not internal development.
And that structure didn't just vanish when independence came. This brings us to the concept of cash crops and the maligned economy.
This is the trap. The colonial powers set up these economies to produce one or two things that Europe needed, say cocoa, palm oil, or rubber, monocultures. When these countries became independent, they were left with an economy that only knew how to do one thing:
So if you are a country whose entire GDP relies on selling cocoa beans to Europe, you aren't really free. You are entirely dependent on the global price of cocoa, which you don't control.
Exactly. And you are dependent on importing finished goods, cars, computers, machinery from the wealthy nations at a high markup. You sell cheap raw materials and buy expensive finished products. It is a formula for perpetual debt.
And the modern twist is that it's not just governments doing this anymore, it's multinational corporations.
Right. A massive corporation might have a budget bigger than the GDP of the country it's operating in. They can dictate terms on labor, environmental regulations, and tax breaks. It's power without borders. It's an invisible empire that creates the same dependency as the old colonial administrators, just with better PR.
So we've mapped out the cold, strategic side of things, shatter belts, choke points, economic webs. That's the political power part of our episode title. But we have to address the other force, the one that actually makes people pick up a weapon or build a wall: territoriality.
This is where we shift from the head to the heart. Political power is about logic and strategy. Territoriality is about identity.
You defined this earlier as the connection people have to the land, but I want to push on that. Is this just instinct, like a dog barking at the mailman? Or is it something more complex?
It's rooted in instinct, the need for security. But in humans, it becomes cultural. It is the deep-seated belief that we belong to this land, and this land belongs to us. It's how we define us versus them.
And we see this physically manifest in borders. I think we often assume borders are just legal lines where the jurisdiction changes. But if you look at the news, borders are emotional scar tissue.
Absolutely. When a country builds a wall or a fence, it's not just a security measure. It is a statement of territoriality. It says we are protecting our culture and our way of life from whatever is outside. It's an attempt to freeze that map in place.
Now, I want to bring up something from the sources here. And just to be clear for you listening, our goal is just to convey the ideas presented in the text impartially. The reading uses the Russia-Ukraine conflict as a prime case study for this clash between legal borders and territorial perception.
It's a tragic but perfect example of the concept. In 1991, the Soviet Union fell, and Ukraine became a sovereign state with internationally recognized borders. Legally, the lines were drawn.
But the mental map in Moscow didn't match the legal map on the wall.
Correct. The materials point out that Russian leadership maintained a historical narrative that Ukraine, or significant parts of it, was culturally and historically part of the Russian sphere. That sense of territoriality, that belief that the land was theirs in a spiritual or historical sense, overrode international law.
It really highlights that territoriality isn't rational. You can argue that a war is bad for the economy or strategically risky, but if the drive is, this is our homeland, those rational arguments go out the window.
That's why these conflicts are so hard to solve. You can negotiate over oil prices. You can negotiate over tariffs. It is very hard to negotiate over identity.
And it's not just nation states, right? We see this friction with indigenous groups all over the world.
They do. Indigenous territoriality often clashes with state territoriality. You might have a First Nations group in Canada or a tribe in the Amazon whose ancestral connection to the land ignores modern borders entirely. Their map is based on history and culture, not on the Treaty of Westphalia.
Even something as benevolent as a national park fits into this. When a government draws a line around a forest and says, this is a park, that is an act of territorial dominance.
It is. It's the state saying, we control this resource. We decide that no one lives here, no one mines here. It's a benign form of control, but it is still an assertion of power over space.
So we've got these two engines running the world: political power, stupidity, the chess players moving pieces, seizing choke points, and structuring economies, and territoriality, the human need to belong to a place and keep others out.
And the chaos of our world usually happens where those two forces collide, where the strategic need for resources crashes into the emotional need for a homeland.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave the listener with a contradiction that stood out to me while we were breaking this down. We're seeing a resurgence of hard borders, walls are going up everywhere. Territoriality is loud right now.
It is. Nationalism and border security are major themes in global politics.
But at the exact same time, we have this neo-colonial, globalized economy where money flows instantly. A corporation can move its headquarters, its assets, and its supply chain with a few keystrokes.
That is the paradox of our time.
So here is the question for you to mull over. If money and influence can walk right through walls, do the walls even matter anymore? Are we moving toward a world where the physical map on the wall matters less than the economic map of the corporations?
That's a fascinating thought. We might be heading for a world where we have phantom borders lines that don't appear on any atlas but define where wealth goes and where poverty stays. The map of the future might not be drawn by diplomats but by CEOs.
A sobering thought to end on. The map is not the territory, and the lines are definitely not static.
Keep watching the lines. They move more than you think.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you on the next one.